Today I am joined by William Wheelwright. William is a writer, an anonymous poster. He microblogs on Twitter at Plowman's Folly, and he is a sort of expert on a more embodied existence, on a more connected existence, essentially on farming. You're a farmer as well, isn't that right, William?
That's right. Yes. And
Excellent.
agree.
Welcome, welcome. This is it's interesting. I mean, this used to be the profession for maybe at least 70 or 80% of the people in the surroundings of the place where I live now, maybe even like 100 years ago. Now being a farmer is something quite specialized. It's something very far away that some people do in very, very big places. You need to be part of some sort of megacorp to be producing eggs or meat or whatever, or at least that's what I'm led to believe, because I've also been, I think, maybe libertarian pilled for a while, thinking that, okay, to produce the cheapest meat and eggs and dairy, you need to have economies of scale. You need to build the mega farm, the 7 million acres of corn or something like that, and that is going to give you the cheapest, most available corn. You're going to be using labor arbitrage, doing it in a cheap area. You're going to be using you're going to be saving money on your fertilizers, all this type of stuff. You, I don't think, agree with this position. You're not libertarian pilled in that direction. So what's wrong with this perspective? I mean, isn't having more food, cheaper food, abundance, isn't that what we're looking for?
Yes, abundance is what we're looking for. Before I answer that question, I just want to compliment Romania's beautiful agricultural tradition. One thing one of the really cool things that they do is they'll take, spruce trees or other coniferous trees that have what they call a whorl pattern of branches. So they have, every year puts on, say, five more branches. And if you have a 20-year-old tree, you have, you know, 30 feet of kind of whorls, like little levels, where essentially what they'll do is they'll take them out to the hayfield, and the men will start making the hay, and the women will climb to the top of these trees that have been, that don't have any needles on them anymore. And over the course of the day, the men with these long pitchforks will pitch the hay up to the women who are standing on the, like, 30 feet in the air. And there are these very beautiful kind of conical shapes, haystack shapes that are unique to somewhere in Romania, I understand. I mean, there's
Yeah,
pictures of it.
everywhere. That's really interesting. To me, they're just so common that I didn't even realize that this was like a unique thing. This is just like haystacks. I did see that they were like mechanically, made perfectly into perfect cubes in the West, but I thought that's just like, oh, they moved on from the tree haystacks to the cubes. So I didn't know it was different anywhere else. But yeah, they're everywhere here. Like the second you drive out, like, I don't know, 5 minutes outside of the city, you'll very likely encounter some of those haystacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know about the women though, like the climbing up. To be honest, I've never seen one in progress. I just seen the finished result. Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's cool. Anyway, so to answer your question, the scale question is very easy, or very interesting, and I think that, it's my instinctual response to it is to point out the undeniable fact that the scale of nature actually dwarfs the scale of industry. If you think of just the massive, especially in grassland ecosystems, just these massive expanses that would cause an industrialist to go pale, in terms of trying to figure out how to manage the whole thing. And so, well, I'm not against large scale. I'm pro, very large scale. I think what we need to focus on is, and you alluded to this, talking about labor. What we need to focus on is the what Wendell Berry calls the eyes to acre ratio. And you also said, not so long ago, 70 to 80% of the people in your area were farmers, and that's true generally, throughout the West, throughout the world. It's even higher in some places, of course. And I think, what the problem is that agriculture has become, unhuman, and that has that's the cause of the effect of the fact that, our food is bad for us now. Our food is not food. It's unfood. It's something else. It's something that actually makes us, fat and unhealthy, rather than fit and and capable of doing things, doing things physically. So, which of course that's what it's supposed to be. So I think that what needs to be done isn't necessarily like this sort of you know kind of a homesteader pilled trad thing that sometimes gets advocated for of small holders. Although I do think there's a place for that in some contexts. But in terms of like production agriculture, I think that we need to start thinking about ways to reverse what has been now a 200 plus year process of getting people out of agriculture, which has really been uh, the most identifiable and consistent trend in farming since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This all started with the invention of the threshing machine, which is very interesting history in England where it was invented. It was the first kind of like labor reducing machine. Threshing is the separation of the wheat from the chaff with small grains, and it took before this machine was invented. It took you know whole villages of people to actually get this job done in a timely manner. Essentially, you take those bundles of wheat that you'll see in old painting stuff and just smack them against like a stone floor or something over and over again until the wheat and the chaff separate. And this machine essentially it has two rubber rollers that you send it through, and it just rubs the things apart. And so it does the work of 50 men. And basically, people rioted when these things came out and went around and got drunk and destroyed them and just were angry because they saw what was coming and that they would end up in a factory somewhere, which so many of them did shortly thereafter, and from the invention of other machines as well. Anyway, so that's the beginning of a trend of urbanization and that obviously
Yeah.
has a human cost in terms of making people's lives miserable, which we're obviously dealing with now, and very often in the discourse on our side of Twitter, talking about the longhouse, etc. And but also it makes the food inedible and disease causing. So it's
Yeah.
bad in both ways, worst of both worlds.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have an anecdote. I think it was about the thrashing machine and the origin of the word saboteur.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know this? Like
No, no,
the French peasants used to throw their like clogs into the machine to ruin it
yeah.
during some of these kind of early industrial revolution riots, and they
Mhm.
were sabotaging the machine with their sabots, like the shoes themselves. So that's an interesting origin etymology.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, there's a very beautiful English like folk song called the Dalesman's Litany, um, which is about kind of this whole story of kind of um, people essentially being who have been in certain areas on certain land for many generations during that time period, having no other choice than to go and work in um, uh, factory type conditions, and how how like terrible that was. And in the song, eventually the couple that is being sung about gets like kind of like gets through to the end of their life and is able to return to the countryside, and they're like happy again. But there's not like much hope for for future generations. So
yeah. You outline kind of a kind of a clear tension that exists usually within these discussions, and there's kind of this whole new movement with like you said, kind of homesteady, it's a relatively larpy adoption of kind of agriculture as almost like just a lifestyle choice. And I, to be honest, I agree with that. I think LARPing certain things, even because to be honest, not many people can hand down these things. Like my grandfather was, lived his life in subsistence agriculture when he was a younger man, and he didn't miss it. He didn't miss like the physical toil, and he didn't miss the I don't know, the fact that this was literally subsistence agriculture, so there wasn't any like industrial fertilizer. There were harsh seasons, and were famines, and like this is Eastern Europe, and like before the Red Army came. Like there's this is like almost medieval levels of poverty. So they were very much kind of at the mercy of the elements. But he every almost every night he dreamt of his horses. he had this whole thing, and he was is interesting because he was still kind of there. He was still kind of connected to the land, even after it was made impossible by the communists to actually, you know, be in agriculture. At least for his family, it was made impossible because they were considered kabur, which is like more wealthy peasants. So they had to be expropriated, and he had to be forced into different. I mean, he wasn't in like forced labor, but he only had a certain type of employment that he could, engage in. So he became a miner because that was one of the limited set of things that he could do. But still, this kind of this haunting dream of his horses that he cared about more than anything in the world kept creeping up. Like he would talk about them every day. That's probably one of the only memories that I have from my grandfather. I mean, this isn't making much of a point, but I feel like there's something that is lost and something that is to be gained, even if you're not going all out or taking on the full burden of, your own subsistence through your homesteading garden. Like I've got like an herb garden and I make a few edibles here in my little, semi-urban garden. But it's such an important thing to me and for my child and for, the people in my household that even if I didn't take anything out of the garden, just a simple act of keeping it is something, it connects me to something that I really don't feel connected to in any other part of my life. It just, it's a breath of fresh air. What it is, I don't know, but I feel like it's worthwhile, even if it's not, you know, yeah, if it's not feeding the world.
Mhm. Yeah, I've caused some controversy on Twitter by saying, people who these sort of prepper types who which are certainly prevalent in America. I'm not sure how prevalent they are in Europe. It seems to be kind of a more American phenomenon. But people who essentially go into it with their priorities, in my opinion, mixed up, which is to say that they go into it saying, I've got to be self-reliant and grow everything for my family that we need in order to survive the apocalypse, etc. Obviously, that has its own problems in terms of like the sort of what would you say, political like probabilities that are likely to actually take place in such a scenario. But it's also spiritually, I think, misguided because it's not about this the reason that you would want to live that lifestyle is not so that you can like not be reliant on any other human being outside of yourself and your family, but it's that there is um, a deep spiritual enrichment in just being, as you had described, connected to, creation, connected to life. And I think the animal thing with the horses is so important. Obviously, this gets sort of transmuted and and you know in a deformed way through like you see these urban late mid 30s females getting their 15-pound canine specimens, but like the human connection to animals is something that is just a wildly underappreciated loss, and I think we see this on Twitter a lot with people, the various accounts that just post like fun videos of, fun clips of like animals, orangutans, and but also horses and sheep and cows and pigs. It's very important for us to be around these beasts. I think there's is a bit normy of me, but James Herriot has. Have you ever read his this English? Well, actually, he was Scottish, but he was a veterinarian who practiced in Yorkshire and just was a very gifted writer as well, and wrote autobiographical little short stories, many books worth of them, of encounters he had with these people, these Dales people who were just very very deeply rooted farmers of various sorts. And one of the most moving of those was this one about how one of these, I think a particularly older guy who he was doing a call for a cow or something. He was hanging out after having healed the cow, and the farmer was very appreciative, so he brought him to this very beautiful glade, like kind of tucked away on the other side of his farm, and it was where he was keeping it's just like this heavenly spot, and with a river running through it, and there was just this one little barn, and it was where he was keeping his retired horses, like four of them. So they weren't doing any work for him, but he gave them like the nicest spot with, the most beautiful scenery and best grass and stuff. And it's just, obviously, you were talking about libertarians and like economic maximalizers. This would be insanity to someone like that. But I think to someone like your grandfather, there's just something much deeper there, especially the connection with animals. And as you may have noted, I'm more of an animal. I have a garden and I like to grow plants and mushrooms too. But for me, it's all about being with the herd. So I think
Yeah.
that's where I get a lot of inspiration from.
Yeah, yeah. There is something to kind of respecting animals at that level, because at the moment, kind of, I feel like our mainstream culture has um, two strangely disembodied ways of dealing with animals. They're either kind of sacred, where you have like veganism. You don't touch them. It's completely taken out of the food chain. They've got qualia and whatever rationalist stuff that people talk about regarding animals. Or there's kind of this, you will eat them, but you don't want to know anything about the process, like factory farming, just like they put them in a box, grow the chicken in a bottle, cut its head off when it's a certain age old, but don't tell me about it. And you just kind of have these slabs of meat, which is really interesting because, like, in Romania, like the name of the animal is the name of the meat. You don't have the cow, beef, poultry, chicken stuff. It's like it's very direct. Like, there's no we don't have specific names for the slabs of meat. It's all just the animals as the meat. So I feel like it's a little bit, just even like culturally, a bit more close to the fact that literally, I mean, my parents used to slaughter pigs when I was younger. It's something that we did around the holidays. It was something that the whole family participated in. It was really scary. I used to hide in the basement because the sounds are pretty gruesome, I have to admit. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff around kind of that closeness. So there must be like a middle way where we understand that, okay, we're also part of the food chain, but these animals, they also need a certain amount of respect. But somehow I feel like no one's really getting that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also to the extent to which we do connect to like live animals mainly through dogs and cats. I think Bap has a famous thing about the border collie in the city apartment, making him want to destroy entire nations. Something like this. I agree with that completely. I think not that you actually see very many border collies in urban places, but it's mostly, as I was saying, these little rat-like things. Uh, but I think that the dogs and cats up until 70 years ago existed for specific purposes. Obviously for dogs in particular, they served a wide variety of purposes, but and cats obviously, if you can't store grain before like plastic and concrete without cats. It's just not really a you're gonna starve in the winter. So and like I think, and so we've segregated even those animals from like the purposes that they've been bred for, in a way that is of a piece of the same pattern, with like the rest of what's been going on in the world in terms of life and its essences. So I think also, yeah, like, or when you mentioned the thing about like meat, and as a guy who's sold a lot of meat, I think that people really like the unknowledge, like the ability to not know where something came from, actually is something that people are willing to pay for. It's like a quantifiable percentage of the value of like a chicken breast, is not having to think about it in the grocery store. And it's a very difficult thing to surmount, because you'll get people like coming up to you at the farmer's market or whatever and saying, oh, it's like wonderful, local farm, like let me, like, I'll get some, like this actually happens. It's like, they'll want to see the products, and then they'll realize like, oh wait, like did you kill this? And um sometimes yes, sometimes no, but like I'll be like yes, and then it's like the interest is gone. It's very interesting, and people like realize they're sort of thrust into back into reality, and in this like we're kind of already in the metaverse in terms of our food consumption, as far as like there's another reality that is totally obscured and forgotten about behind the scenes, and people are living in sort of this bliss in terms of how where it actually comes from, and what this material actually is and represents and once was. And so yeah, it's death and dealing with the fact that um, I think it ultimately just it's an alienation from like mortality writ large, not even necessarily one's own mortality, but I think something interesting about COVID too, in terms of why it's driven people so mad, is that all of a sudden, living whereas we've lived in a society for so long where um, death is sort of this like thing that may show up one day, and we rarely, at least in the West, we rarely have to deal with like a loved one dying or someone dying unexpectedly, something like that. And all of a sudden there's something like COVID that you know freaks everybody out, makes everybody have to think about this. And it's there's an enormous amount of societal, there's that has a certain value for people, and it allows things to operate in a certain way, and that may not be a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I feel like the through line through a lot of the insanity that you comment on, and a lot of the people in this thing of ours comment on, is this denial of death. It really is kind of the core of it, and I feel like it's because the denial of death guarantees that you can have kind of this, the homunculus continues, the choice making entity behind the eyes is still there, and it's inextinguishable, and you can continue to consent to a lot of weird stuff if you the consumer continues. Like you don't want to be spooking your consumer with things like death. It's unpleasant. Don't tell them about that.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, it definitely spooks them. Their eyes kind of widen, and yeah, but I've posted about this, and this it's a difficult thing to wrap your mind around. I always recommend, especially to my Catholic followers, this to follow Farmstead Meatsmith, who's a couple with their family who are butchers and traditional Catholics, and just have a very beautiful way of describing and explaining what they do, and the sort of kind of philosophical extensions and implications of it. And one of and so I've been inspired by them, and borrowed a lot from them, in terms of talking about it's very difficult for modern people, especially given their relationship to like pets and things like that I was talking about before, to wrap their minds around the idea that a farmer could like truly love and care for his animals, and want, like, will the best for them, um, while at the same time like planning on killing them at the end of a certain period of time. And just it's it's very difficult to describe, but I just think, having experienced it myself over and over again, um, it's absolutely, within the realm. It's absolutely like somehow becomes possible in reality, and it's a very strange and beautiful thing to I mean, for one thing, with certain with certain kinds of animals like poultry, you're constantly saving them from death, at the hands of various of the weather, of predators, of with turkeys, for example. They'll find they constantly are finding new creative ways to commit suicide, just like jumping off things, and whatever, getting sitting out in the rain when there's shelter right next door and they don't realize it, but that sort of thing, and they get pneumonia. But you know, with animals that aren't susceptible to to dying, due to random causes, like pigs and cows and stuff. Um, I think what you realize, and I think I posted about this. It's coming back to me now. The post that I made that provoked some interest. It was a while ago, but one thing that you realize is that they don't exist in time the way that human beings do. They don't they don't experience. I don't think they experience their days as like successive. Especially not once they've reached maturity. Um, I think that for them, it's not a matter of days and weeks and years and months. It's a matter of breaths. Like they just want to survive to the next breath, and that's their goal. And time and death and time are closely related, obviously. And and also the fact that so when when you domesticate an animal, you're taking on responsibility for its death, because the alternative is that it essentially reaches some incredibly old age under your care, and rots from the inside out, which is what happens, and it's not pretty. I've seen it happen when I was younger, and so you have to dispatch them before they reach that point out of mercy. And so the question is, at what point are you going to dispatch them? And that becomes interesting because once they've reached a certain maturity, to them, I don't think it makes any difference. I don't think that like a longer life is different from a shorter life to a sheep. Just I don't think that they experience time. Having observed them all my life, I don't think that animals experience time the way that humans do. And it's something about like the human condition, original sin or something like that, and that makes it that way. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's kind of just a part of this whole tragic dimension of human life that we're tried to. I mean, all of the cultural forces around us are trying to make us forget about. It's the fact that we're all going to die. That is probably going to be gruesome. That it might be earlier or sooner rather than later. All of this stuff, is just completely put by the wayside. And the idea that a cow might live 3 years instead of, I don't know, 5 or 6 or whatever, maybe, I don't know, 10 years, if like you said, they end up decaying from the inside out. How do you quantify this? It's one of those things that we have one measure. It's lifespan. We want to maximize lifespan, and if you get to 100, then you've cashed out all your chips. And even if you feel absolutely horrible for the last 20 years of your life, at least you've maxed out. You've become one of the good statistics. Yeah, I just it's I feel like it's very hard for people to understand that in some cases, long life might be not as not preferable to a shorter just different, more focused existence.
The calamity of such long life. Yeah. Um,
It's a strange thing. Like we've never really we're almost up to like Abrahamic levels of longevity, but it's really hard to actually take care of people at that age.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and especially, I don't know if you've seen this video. It's gone around a couple times on Twitter, but there's a very just heartbreaking video of kind of a boomer-looking woman who someone, sort of TikTok type personality approaches in a store to ask her, like, I forget what, it's part of a larger series of clips of this interviewer approaching people, and basically it just like takes a turn for the worse, because she's like, yeah, I don't have anybody, like I don't have a family, I never had kids, like I was in like the 70s when I was in my 20s and 30s, it just people were worried about like overpopulation, and I just wasn't, that kind of thing. And she's like, well, I have like music, and like the point that I'm making is just, I don't know, it just makes me very melancholic, but to see something like that. But I think I think that we're gonna, not only right now we're dealing with like the fact that not even boomers yet, but like greatest uh, generation people are like living indefinitely, and then it'll be boomers, and then we're gonna have to deal with the fact that like a lot of like Gen Z people who don't even have like families to live for. Like I have, thank God, a grandmother who's still alive, and she has two great grandchildren. And like, I think that she literally has the will to live, like because of that. Like she said that, and but like we're not going to have that for a lot of people, in 20 or 30 years, and it's going to get very weird, I think, because yeah, like we've been I don't know, all these things are connected. The fact of death, the fact of mortality, the like what like human the human conundrum, the human condition, original sin, whatever you want to call it, and you know, all like they're related, and they don't they don't like um, they don't operate, they don't influence life independently of each other. And so yeah, I think I don't know, it's going to just get weirder.
Yeah, yeah, I remember seeing that video as well, and just thinking, this is like this woman was infected by an idea at one point. It just took her over and just consumed her, just left her a husk. And then I think at one point she said like, "Oh, what have you been up to?" And she was like, "Oh, I've gotten more involved in politics." And it's like, yeah, that's just an extension of the same like demonic thing that just kind of scooped out your insides and, threw them to the wind. And now, it's still kind of, eating off of you like that parasitic mushroom on that ant. It's yeah, I don't know. It was just really, really sad. And I'm sure she's not, you know, the GOP politician supporting person.
Yeah, you can see it in you can see it in her face, and like the way she folds her hands, that she's like she's tortured by it. That's that's my read. And she has to cope with it. She's been coping with it, so she's like learned how to how to like deal with it like day by day. And but it's just it's like you can't take it back. I think it's interesting. It applies. I don't know. That's something that actually connects back to the farm thing, which is that this notion of permanence and or not, permanence is maybe misleading. What I mean is undertaking projects and decisions that you can't really undo that easily. Obviously, in this woman's case, you can't undo it at all. At least not yet with at our current level of technological advancement. But I think a lot of the problem with where we're at in farming and where we're at in society is that we've sort of we've invested ourselves on a certain track that that happens to be one that's very difficult to get off of, and that any attempt to get off of kind of just like reinforces the gravitational pull. And so I think what kind of part of what we're dealing with and part of what people are sort of memeing solutions for, many of which are not viable, on Twitter and elsewhere, is how to veer in one direction or the other. And yeah, it's just I think this notion of flexibility and being able to avoiding the kinds of decisions that entrap you. Um, it's amazing. Like just for example, with relatives who are of a certain generation involved in managing the same land that I'm managing, their kind of eagerness to like undertake projects and decisions that like cannot be undone like without great cost. And I'm just like, well, what if we don't want that in like 5 years, or 10 years? And it's the same exact situation as that woman. It's like there's just like this kind of faith in things will work out. Thing like what we think, like this random idea that we had is going to be a good idea, and we'll still think that in 5 years or 10 years. Seems to be a very boomer mentality, and it in my personal life drives me a little nuts. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the boomers had the advantage that the Adam Smith adage that there's a lot of ruin in a nation was actually the case then. But I feel like at this point, the ruins kind of run out, or at least it's starting to dwindle. As the pressure you can put on a system that worked well with all the crazy boomer ideas is starting to kind of evaporate. I seen, I think it was a relatively recent thread of yours about grass-fed dairy, which you kind of pinpoint as key to a sustainable agricultural system, and I thought was really interesting because like, I mean, I keep relating this to what I see happening here. Like dairy really isn't that that big here. You kind of have, a few milk cattle, and you use, we also use sheep for milk. It's just a kind of different ecosystem. And I wonder why is dairy kind of the cornerstone to this kind of sustainable ecosystem?
So the reason is that um, grass, perennial grass, in the vast majority of the world's land is the most sustainable thing to grow, and that's because most of the world's land is grassland, or at least was before it was desertified. And you can just refer to the historians of the ancient world for to find out which places used to be grassland. Much of North Africa, obviously the quote unquote Fertile Crescent, was once fertile. Now it is desert, and this is due to what ecologists call unknown processes. But in reality, it's just due to bad management and tillage and bad management of livestock. Basically, are the two reasons. But the point is to say that grass is what grows in most of the world, and agriculture at its best is not a superimposition of some preordained committee driven plan on top of some on top of what is naturally on a given acreage. It is ensconced um, and directly participates in the ecological processes that are going on, that pre-existed, and that are native to that spot. And so grass, uh, as the sort of the thing that the basic building block of the ecosystems of most of the world's land, is by far the most sustainable thing that we can base a nation or a community's caloric needs off of. But the problem is that human beings can't digest grass, and so we need to run it through some other means in order to make it into something that we can eat. And the way to do that is through herbivores. And so once you've realized that you need herbivores, this applies to any herbivore. This can be uh, cows, sheep, camels, goats, reindeer, wildebeest, bison. The list goes on. Any ruminant, which is just a mammal that has a rumen that has a stomach that can digest roughage and turn it into energy and meat and milk and leather and wool, etc. You can say that maybe once you've got that, you're trying to figure out what product, once you're there, in terms of things that you can eat, you're sort of choosing between meat and milk. And just from a sort of calories per acre perspective, milk is by far much more productive than meat. You if you say that you were doing, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I can give you a rough approximation. Say that you were, if you wanted to produce the same amount of calories of grass-fed beef as grass-fed cow's milk on 1,000 acres, it would take many more head of cattle. You would just be producing, or sorry, the limit isn't your goal of caloric production. It's how many acres you have. It would take you would, if you had 100 acres, you would be producing way fewer calories of beef than you would be of milk if you were. And obviously, one of the byproducts of dairy is veal, and of sheep's dairy is suckling lamb, or whatever you want to call it. And it doesn't have to be veal. You can raise it out to beef, but or to a full grown lamb if you have the means to do that, or the land to do that. But the point is just that calorically, dairy is much more productive on sort of the conversion is much more efficient. And so it doesn't have to be dairy, but I recommend dairy because it just, from a caloric perspective, takes a lot fewer acres to feed the same amount of people. From if the idea is to convert grass into human digestible calories, then dairy is the way to go. So that's why I advocate for grass-fed dairy.
Yeah, that's really interesting because here you essentially only have grass-fed dairy. I mean, and there's probably more industrial stuff that I'm not aware of, but that's kind of traditionally been the case. But you don't really have beef, like people don't really eat cattle. It's just essentially they just keep them for dairy purposes, and it
Mhm.
might be kind of like an ancestral intuition that you don't want to be eating your your dairy cow, and also. It does seem to me that there are different species, like the cattle that you raise for beef tend to be a bit different to the ones that you raise for milk. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, it has become that way in recent years, in recent decades. But traditionally, and the same goes for poultry, like egg laying chickens versus meat chickens. This distinction is a modern phenomenon, and it's just yeah, it's like sort of a post-war as these things became industrialized and everything became much more siloed and specific and specialized. Um, Different things were raised for different purposes and bred for those purposes. But many breeds, that are currently beef breeds could, in a in a dire situation, be used as dairy breeds. It's just that the two or three like exceptional breeds for dairy that produced an amazing amount of milk, Holsteins and Jerseys and Guernseys, cows like this, became the dairy industry's darlings, and then Angus and Herefords became the beef industry's darlings. So, and same thing has happened in every species. So, yes, but like you can still eat dairy cows for beef, and it probably wouldn't make economic sense to like milk an Angus cow. She'd probably also kick you, but it's still possible. I mean, she obviously produces milk. She has to have. She raises a calf for every year for 6 months. So that's or more, or depends on the farmer how long they take to wean them. But 6 months is pretty normal. Yeah, so those things have become kind of bifurcated, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon. But of course, they've come up with ways to like accelerate the genetic evolutionary process. So there are, yeah, it's amazing, it's insane how much milk like a Holstein produces. It's like ridiculous amount of milk per day. So
Yeah, I think was it like a Charolais beef or something like that? There is
mhm,
this kind of
mhm.
type of cattle that just looks insane, insanely jacked.
Yeah, the bulls. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah, they're
my
very
god.
lean. They're very, yeah. The French, it's the British breeds are the fatty breeds, the Devons and the Bradfords and so on, and Dexters, which are Irish, but I don't know how racist we want to get here.
As racist as possible.
um, but the yeah, so typically the British Isle breeds, and this goes for pork too, are fattier, and then when you get into France and Italian breeds, they tend to be leaner and more suited to they don't need all that fat to stay warm in the cold rainy climates of the British Isles, which is interesting. And it just like the notion of a Sunday roast versus just turning everything into prosciutto or bresaola. These things have cultural implications.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I never realized that. It's that makes sense, I guess. Yeah. It's very
Mhm,
cool.
mhm.
Um Another thing that you've just alluded to, you haven't made a big thing out of it, but I think you commented a little bit on what's been going on in certain U.S. cities. I mean, there's been a few like high profile, like really nutty, aggressive situations. I mean,
Mm,
that probably are more visible kind of in the distant right than in other places because
definitely, yeah.
media doesn't really report on them. But I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, to me, I've just kind of been like scrolling through what's been going on the last few days, and it just seemed like there's a bit of a almost like a like a narco tyranny is reaching like a fever pitch.
Mhm, mhm.
Maybe it's also a bit of a filter bubble, but this is like I don't know, quite.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
well, I mean, Tucker reaches millions and millions of people. So when Tucker's talking about something, then it's I don't I hesitate to say it's like firmly in the mainstream, but as you said, like this recent thing in Memphis, I guarantee you that if you were to ask the average, even moderate, like left wing American voter, they would have no idea that it even happened. It just due to the reality of like the media. situation. But yeah, what do I make of it? I mean, I think it's insane. It's insane what even I think that it's like, there's this sort of this narrative, and Tucker basically, I watched Tucker's clip on the Eliza Fletcher thing, and there's this narrative that kind of from like the riots of 1968 after Martin Luther King was assassinated, et cetera, and Bobby Kennedy, that like white flight basically happened because of that, and then all these cities just like went to hell, and that's definitely true to some extent. But like a lot of these cities also were like basically fine, up until like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. They had, certain cities, you that I grew up visiting, they were very orderly places. They weren't necessarily like, it's not like they had had some sort of like neoclassical renaissance and everything was like beautiful and like these colorized videos of the women were all walking around in like long dresses and stuff like that, and whatever. But you didn't have to, like when you rode on the subway, there wasn't a guarantee that some insane schizophrenic person was going to be like terrorizing everyone. Like there's like a 1 in 5 chance of that happening or something. Like you just have to be ready for that, like every 5 train rides. So it seems to me that yeah, like we were talking about with the clip of that particular woman. There's a certain like ideology, uh, belief system that has the qualities of a virus, that leads people to advocate for policies that make life hell for the majority of people. And for whatever reason, and yeah, there's just this obsession that probably really has its is only allowed to proliferate because of the like boredom and the comfort and the like lack of excitement in the lives of the average American voter, particularly in urban areas, that they need some cause. And this is and certain actors have capitalized and taken advantage of that, consciously or subconsciously, that particular psychological collective reality. And it just like you can see its fruits right now. It's like a real thing. It's not that it's I think obviously, like you were saying, I think if you just lived on Twitter and didn't actually visit any American cities, you would have an inflated perception of what's going on. But I have friends in many different American cities, and normie friends who are definitely getting fed up with this type of thing. And that obviously what we're talking about was an extreme example, but there's micro versions of that happening all the time.
Yeah, all over the
Yeah,
world. Like
yeah,
I've
yeah,
never lived in like Baltimore or Chicago or something like that, but I have lived in East London, and it was enough.
yeah,
It was
yeah.
enough for me to draw some conclusions. Yeah, I don't know if I have a very like well thought out thing, but to me, even this ties into like that denial of death type of thinking, because there's just something about when you have a system that imposes order, you kind of have to look at this finite hierarchy of life. You kind of have to internalize that, and then that kind of cuts off the kind of this utopian open-endedness that a lot of these policies feed into. Like, for example, you can't outlaw abortion because what if what if there's some crazy, like a 10-year-old gets raped, and there's these crazy edge cases that you can't impose order, because what if there's like a nightmare scenario in that weird space, like that liminal space outside of the order thing, where you kind of have these costs imposed by order. We cannot swallow these costs imposed by order at all. And in a way, that was the case with COVID as well. Like even COVID in a way was kind of in a way an excess of order to combat that, but it was essentially like the denial of death turned into policy. So I don't know. It just feels like that. Like really, people just cannot even think about what it would mean to absorb these sometimes much smaller costs imposed by order, like, the death penalty, another big example in this case. There's serious, like mass incarceration, another thing that's one of pretty much the only things that actually worked in the 90s. Like there are all these things that people just don't cannot even imagine swallowing these costs anymore. It's just beyond the pale. You'd rather have like anarchy,
Yeah.
just not you don't even want to think about it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I completely agree with you that it's of a piece with the death thing that there's it's basically this like wild optimism about reality and human nature. On the one hand that like we can transcend death in some way. Basically, it's like their ultimate the ultimate like logical conclusion of their not just for humans but for animals and so on. And then on the other hand, that like people can be rehabilitated and or obviously there are some people that can be rehabilitated, but that like anybody can be rehabilitated and that like we can like this kind of Rousseauian take on human nature that it's something societal that is corrupt, that is causing these types of behaviors, and that if we simply need to like give them even more leeway, and
Exactly.
yeah, and you know, I don't think that it's I think what it comes down to is this drastically misplaced, and I think in many cases genuine, but nevertheless drastically misplaced sense of mercy. The people look at the downtrodden and the like inner city poor, and they feel sorry for them, and they attribute when they behave in ways that are criminal or whatever, they attribute that behavior to some other cause. And I think that, but for me, you know, my life experiences have led me to believe that it's not merciful to accept that kind of behavior. And I think actually one of my favorite ever takes was on one of your shows with Mary Harrington, where this was during I think it was during the heat of the Antifa, like Portland attacking the federal courthouse in Portland riots. And Mary had this brilliant take, which was that these people are crying out for authority, crying out for to be punished, basically. This kind of like Foucauldian take, and I think it's just absolutely true. Like, and it's humorous to imagine them, and we would see like at night we would see these clips of like the area around this courthouse in flames and all these insane people in black bloc, trying to tear down this fence, and then like the next day it would be the mayor of Portland being like we just need to understand each other better, like we need to have a dialogue, and but like you can just imagine the sort of like the the Antifa people in their heart of hearts being like, oh, like all we want is to be thrown in prison, like that's what we're desperate for something um paternal and authoritative to tell us what to do. And I think along those same lines, with I think that like the increase in criminality, the wantonness, and there was literally just today this guy also in Memphis going around shooting people and live streaming it on Facebook. I don't know if you saw that, but like that's another example of just like it's going to escalate more and more until somebody comes along and imposes authority, says like this is unacceptable, because that's what's and like especially in America, I don't know what it's like where you grew up, but that was the sort of like guiding principle of parenting and like teaching and stuff. It was that like we need to essentially like yield to the will of the subject, and are like that's like the way to rule, basically. And in reality that just produces chaos, and the subjects know that, and they are through their behavior, I think subconsciously actually crying out for authority to be imposed upon them. And I think it's not merciful to like have this is kind of a normie conservative point, but it's not, the soft bigotry of low expectations or whatever. But this is on an even low. That phrase came from like SAT testing or not SAT, but standardized testing or whatever in the No Child Left Behind in the 2000s. This they wanted there to be standardized testing, so they said there should be a standard for everybody. But like even on an even more basic level than that, just not committing crimes and not and participating in society in a way that is considered acceptable. These are not. It's actually more merciful to impose expectations on some level, in my opinion. And I think that a lot of people silently agree with that.
Yeah, I think once you're a parent, you kind of see what the like end result is of the this the line of argument that you just need to kind of cherish the I don't know, choosing agent in people, because your kids will kill themselves
Mhm.
swiftly if you don't impose order. They even look to you to impose order. They're going to test
Yeah,
boundaries. That's it's essentially when you raise a child, you can see that they have an order module, and if you don't exercise that order framework around them, they it's a lack. They'll suddenly start crying. They're anxious. You need to have boundaries with your children, and you need to have boundaries socially, because there's this kind of like it's all based on this egalitarian assumption, which essentially, fuels consumerism, fuels globalism, fuels all these ideas of we can all kumbaya together. Yeah, in certain ways we can, but in other ways, there's a clear inequality in every sort of human arrangement that you can imagine, and we just can't stomach it. So we fill our heads with these I don't know, illusions of equality, and then you obviously reach these points where, oh, the only difference between you and, I don't know, the guy who, I don't know, rape murdered some woman last night, is that he's just missing education. No one stood him down and told him, like, don't rape, don't
mhm.
murder, it's not nice. No, there really are, some other fundamental issues there that you can't remedy through a workshop, but that's just inadmissible in the way we're taught to think.
Yeah, yeah, and like, why should we care? Like, who cares what the reason is? Like we what the like presupposition of that statement that um, that it's because he didn't get an education or whatever is that there's some level on which we should accept that in society, and obviously that's the most extreme thing most people can imagine, or maybe not the most, but it's one of like the top five most extreme things people can imagine. That's why this particular story has gotten a lot of attention. But like even the sort of like broken windows policy that Giuliani had in New York, and Bloomberg really carried on into the 2000s, was this notion that like in order to prevent that kind of behavior, which according to, you can talk to people who lived in New York in the 70s and 80s and ask them what it was like, but in order to prevent that kind of like insane, anarchic, hellish chaos, what you need is to like clamp down very aggressively on the tiny stuff, like the littering and the like in a Singaporean way. And stop and frisk was essentially the manifestation of this that is no longer like, I forget how it legally got shut down, but like how much, what are we willing to tolerate, and to what extent, what volume, and like uh, seemingly the answer from a certain cadre is like a lot. And I think that I have faith, and I was just talking about this with some friends, that like these sorts of instances in America, it's just people just aren't. I think that people have gotten, people remember, and memory, uh, and knowledge of history, but specifically just living memory, is a safeguard against this psyoping that like what you just described, like, oh, like we have to accept it, like they're they just didn't get, nobody taught them, you know
Yeah.
uh, that's not going to be, I don't think people will put up with that.
You have to be like extremely mind wormed to be victimized personally and still like harbor these feelings. And just statistically speaking, by the way everything's ratcheting up, avoiding being victimized personally is getting harder and harder. Like, the neighborhood where used to live, every few days, yeah, there's a stabbing, there's this and that. I personally wasn't stabbed, luckily, but I know people who have, and it's at one point things ratchet up to a point where it's pretty hard to square with the workshop based approach and with the, oh, we just need more social services. And if you're even just slightly still attached to reality, you see that, okay, something's got to give here, and then you might be looking into what's going on, and then you might find our corner of Twitter, and then God help you. But yeah, it's I mean that seems to be the trajectory for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah.
Yeah, it's a strange time to be living in, but I guess I think what can't go on won't go on, and that's
Mhm,
that's the feeling that I have about many things. Unfortunately, also good things,
mhm.
like, I don't know, the electrical grid, which is another.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I don't know. You guys seem to be a little bit more protected from what is going on in Europe, but what is going on in Europe is messed up. It's very, very complicated, and Romania is not even the worst. But like, if, for example, we have a family company and we do like some sort of, I don't know, metal finishings and stuff like that. It's very energy intensive, and it's still barely holding on. But if we were in Germany, we would have had to close down shop like weeks ago. It would have just like impossible, shut off everything. And there's machinery that if you stop it, you can't turn it back on. It's just the way that thing works. And so many people like that, like hundreds, thousands of companies in Germany, just like and the government's like, oh, maybe you turn it on next year. We'll see how we feel about that. It's just even the weakest pretense that democracy is in the interest of the people, or that is it is even a democracy, is being lost under all this shouting about our democracies, protecting democracy and
Mhm.
all this stuff. Like, it's such a travesty, really.
Yeah. It's very important that trans people have rights in Ukraine. So you'll have to
Of
just accept
course,
the sacrifice. Yeah.
of course.
Um, yeah.
Oh man. Well, on that cheery note, as people have gotten used to being completely white pilled after listening to this this podcast. I want to ask you about your subversive recommendation. Do you have
Oh yeah.
a thinker, writer, living dead, agriculturist
Mhm.
that you want to recommend to people?
Yeah, well, so I was actually thinking about this because I knew this question was coming, and I think some guests have offered highly schizoid recommendations, but and others quite normal. I enjoyed James Poulas's recommendation, by the way. For example, I dare not mention the name, but the yes, people can refer to that episode. But I think for agricultural stuff, I very much for people who enjoy, for autists who enjoy schizophrenic and extremely like abstracted thinking. There's a book by the name of an Australian by the name of Water for Every Farm, written by a fellow named P. A. Yeomans, an Australian. I don't know if you can still get it. I got it, maybe 10 years ago, and it really, if you can understand it, it really. And we didn't get into this, Alex, but the water thing is something that I'm very passionate about and have posted about a lot. So if people go to my Twitter page and look up water management or just water, or yeah, you'll or ponds, you will find interesting threads about that. And a lot of it is inspired, uh, sometimes at 1 or 2 degrees, but by this fellow P.A. Yeomans, who had an incredible oasis farm in Australia, which of course is basically a giant desert. Um, other than very very select coastal strips, but the ability to manage water, the leveraging of technology, and the energy, the great abundance of energy that we have at this moment in history, build water infrastructure in a way that can last for a long time, and can really open up and create abundance of productivity in lands that otherwise would take many centuries or millennia to regenerate. That's a great book to check out if you're interested in that sort of thing. And otherwise, I always have to recommend the poetry and philosophy of T.S. Eliot. Yeah.
Nice. Excellent. Excellent. I don't think we've had TSL recommended. Yeah, I think that's a really good one. Yeah, I mean, unsurprisingly, I had never heard of the water management book, but please do check it out. I might, look it up. There are sources, there are places on the internet where you might find books that are out of print. This is the only way I get them because I'm in Romania, and even just ordering normal print books takes forever, and they're usually not available. So
Yeah,
it's a
well,
whole thing.
I will say real fast that if you look up just sort of relatively normie regenerative agriculture figures like Joel Salatin and Greg Judy, Gabe Brown, Darren Doherty, who's also an Australian. These guys have all been influenced by the thought of PA yeomans in terms of managing their farms with regards to water. So those guys are a way to get secondhand, sort of more normal person friendly information about water management. So and of course, water is the limiting factor. So nothing else matters if you don't have water. So it's pretty important.
Excellent. Another thing to worry about. So yeah, I thank you so much, William. This is really good. I want to point people to your Twitter at Plowman's Folly. Please do follow William. He's a fountain of insight about agriculture and much more. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.